Hi, this morning I'm going to share some information on African spirituality and try to clear up some misconception about African spirituality and our concept of God. Now, first and foremost, we need to understand that to traditional African people, spirituality is the basis of all things in life. It guides all institutions that govern everyday living for the people. Now, many of us here in the West, we have a general misconception and misunderstanding of what African spirituality is. One such misconception is the African concept of God. This misconception arises because we try to interpret African spirituality the same way we interpret or the same way we practice Western religion system. Now, the traditional African way of thinking is as far from the East to the West when it comes to the Western way of thinking. So any attempt to understand African spirituality based on a Western viewpoint will end up being flawed and, the thesis will fall apart. Now, to traditional Africans, God is seen as the essence and ultimate reality of all things. God is not seen as separate from its creation, but it functions in different degrees in and as its creation. Now, it is said by John Mason in his book Black Gods. He says that the Yoruba people, which is a West African traditional society, God is seen in everything and have a different name for God in everything and every circumstances. In the Kemetic scriptures, which is the ancient Egyptian scriptures, in a book called The Knowing of Transformation of Ra and the Overthrowing of Apep, God, or Nebeche, which means Lord of all, is made to say, I came into being from primal matter, coming into being in the multitude of forms from the beginning. Now, this is a clear indication that from the traditional African viewpoint, God is not separate from things, or God is not separate from creation. Now, in relation to man, since God is not separate, our interaction with the Supreme Being is different from that of Western religious system. Unlike Western religions, who require their members to worship God, in the traditional African approach, we are required to cultivate the characteristics of God in our being. These characteristics are personified as the spiritual agencies underlying all bases of life. The misunderstanding of these spiritual agencies has led Western man to think that African people are polytheists, but that's not the case. The rituals and ceremonies that are performed for these so-called gods are actually the methods we use to invoke and develop these spiritual agencies within our own being. In the Yoruba tradition, which is the same West African spiritual tradition, these spiritual agencies are called Orishas. In the Kemetic or the ancient Egyptian system, they are called as Neteru, where we get the Latin word natura, where we get the word nature from. Now, in the handbook for the Yoruba religious concept, it says Orisha as a term is actually the combination of two Yoruba words. Ori, which is the relative spark of human consciousness. The word Ori also means head in Yoruba language. And Sha, which is the ultimate potentiality of that consciousness to enter divine consciousness. So here we see that these spiritual agencies, or the orishas, are the means by which our consciousness is united with the divine consciousness, or the consciousness of God. Ra'u Nefer Amen, the leading authority of Kemetic spirituality and someone I look up to and who has taught me a lot in terms of understanding African spirituality, says in his Mitoneta Volume 1 that the Neteru, or deities, represent the laws governing our lives on earth. Observing these laws allow them to fully bring forth their powers through our being. So here we have, from the ancient Egyptian standpoint, that these spiritual agencies are seen as laws in which, when we align ourselves and observe these laws, we manifest the power of the supreme being in our lives. So therefore, the worship of God, according to the traditional African concept, is to develop these spiritual agencies to manifest in our lives, to manifest the power and wisdom of the supreme being in our lives. Now, though God is impersonal to traditional Africans, it becomes personal through us, through our spiritual development. Now, to conclude, African spirituality is not just a religion. It's a complete way of living, a complete way of life. It guides all aspects of our living and our relation with others. Our concept of God cannot be understood from a Western viewpoint because of the different way of thinking of Western man and the traditional Africans. God is not separate from creation. God is not separate from man. The worship of God consists of the cultivation and development of spiritual agencies that are the underlying basis of all things and activities in the world. It is through the process of spiritual cultivation that the supreme being becomes personal in our lives, sharing with us its wisdom and power. So I encourage you, especially my brothers and sisters of African descent, to explore more into the traditions of our ancestors. To dig deeper into African spirituality is to get a deeper understanding of who you are and who God is. It's not a case of being, informed about God through scriptures and sermons, but it's a direct knowledge and experience of God in your daily lives. Peace and blessings. Have a good day.